I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1709 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly. In this episode, we're going to have a special guest. Dr. Bob Rodrigues of Duquesne University is returning to tell us more about the LBJ years in Vietnam. In this episode, he's going to be concentrating on the year of 1965, and he's going to examine in detail many of the events that occurred during that year that had long-time effects, not only during the war, but afterwards. And again, let me encourage you to get rid of all the distractions that might take your attention away from what Dr. Rodrigues is going to talk about in this episode, because it's that important. Turn off the TV. Shut off the phone. Tell all the big talkers to go to another room. Sit back and listen to the important information you're going to hear in this episode. So without any further ado, Dr. Rodrigues, take it away.
February of 1965, by then the South Vietnamese government was tottering. They had had coup after coup after coup. Khan was, there was a coup attempt against Khan. Khan stepped down. A civilian man came in. He lasted 3 days. Khan came back. And then Khan gave it up to a civilian group. Okay, so this is just a series of what they call coups. In fact, Johnson, when he was told about one of the coups, reportedly said, "I'm sick and tired of this coup shit. We need to get somebody over there to stabilize things," end quote. So by then, Johnson was very, very frustrated with the continual change in power in South Vietnam. In February of 65, he authorizes the continuous bombing of North Vietnam south of the 20th parallel. Okay, now keep in mind, the 17th parallel is the dividing point between South and North Vietnam. If you go up 3 parallels, and a parallel is about 67 miles. So you can, kind of imagine that. So they would go up in that sector there where North Vietnam came up against the 17th parallel. This was done after an attack on American soldiers, a Viet Cong attack at the base at Pleiku. At Pleiku, 8 American soldiers were killed. This was actually the 3rd Viet Cong attack since the Gulf of Tonkin. They had attacked the American hotel in Saigon in December, and they had launched another sneak attack at a base in November of 64. That was our response. Now, keep in mind, and I use this as context, in March of 65, we had the Civil Rights March on Selma, Alabama. And this begins under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King. At this point, Dr. King had not expressed any opposition to the Vietnam War. He was really focused on his civil rights movement for African Americans. So he is neutral in this. And remember that Johnson in 1964 had signed the Civil Rights Act. So Martin Luther King did not want to antagonize a government which had now begun to recognize African Americans. Also in March, March 8th, 1965, a very defining time, very defining date, the United States sends their first U.S. combat soldiers to Vietnam. It was the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade. It amounted to 3,500 soldiers. 3,500 soldiers landed at China Beach to defend the airfield at Da Nang on March the 8th, 1965. Now, this is the first group of combat soldiers to arrive in Vietnam. They are essentially boots on the ground. Now, this became quite a debate among some of Johnson's advisors who felt that, once you put soldiers on the ground troops, grunts, now the question becomes, when do you take them out? Do you take them out after total victory? Do you take them out at a propitious point? And what does that do to stabilize or destabilize the situation? So that was the big question about the March deployment of 3,500 American Marines in Vietnam. April 7th, President Johnson delivers the Hopkins University speech. It's a powerful speech, but here's what was most noteworthy of it. In that speech, Lyndon Johnson offered North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh close to $1 billion to develop the Mekong Delta and to develop his nation of North Vietnam. What he basically wanted to do was what Franklin Roosevelt, had done in the United States to the Tennessee Valley during the Great Depression. He electrified the Tennessee Valley and brought, again, electricity and all kind of benefits, telephones, etc., to southern states that had been left out of these basic innovations that had been around for 30, 40, 50 years. So what Johnson was basing this on was he was thinking like a New Dealer. This was a great innovation. This was a great opportunity for North Vietnam to build and become a richer nation. Well, North Vietnam rejected. Ho Chi Minh did not even respond. It was because there was a different focus in North Vietnam. They weren't interested in becoming a modern nation at the cost of not unifying North and South Vietnam, because the shoe that would fall if they accepted this was that they would accept the division between South and North Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh and Le Duan and North Vietnam was not apt to take this offer. April 17th, American B-52s were first used to bomb the Mujia Pass. The Mujia Pass, M-U-G-I-A. This was a pass that hooked up to the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam. So we began to realize that we had to snuff out their artery, which was bringing down supplies and food and medical and of course, military hardware into South Vietnam so they could continue to prosecute the war. At this point, the Viet Cong controlled about 40% of the South Vietnamese countryside. Now, that's pretty impressive. 40%, you're not the government in power, but you control 40% of the countryside. So we felt that you had to get to the roots to destroy the weed. And the roots were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In April, also, April 17th, same time, we had the first large anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C. This was waged by the Students for a Democratic Society. We'll talk more about them when we deal with the counterculture. But there was a significant group of protesters that gathered in Washington, D.C. For this first demonstration. Because, see, now the military draft was beginning to kick into gear. because the regular soldiers were either becoming mustered out or there was a need for a greater number of American soldiers in Vietnam. So the draft was instituted, and this was a byproduct of the Gulf of Tonkin. November 14th to the 18th, 1965. The first conventional battle of the Vietnam War is going to take place in the Central Highlands as American forces clash with the North Vietnamese units in what we know as the Ia Drong Valley. The U.S. 1st Cavalry Division is going to employ newly enhanced techniques of aerial reconnaissance, and they'll finally be able to defeat the NVA, although both sides experience quite a bit of casualties. This Ia Drong battle was portrayed in a Hollywood movie called We Were Soldiers. It was about Hal Moore. Hal Moore was the leader of the cavalry, and quite a leader. And this was a real conventional clash with the NVA. And this is where the North Vietnamese army realized that they could not go toe-to-toe with the United States Army. They would have to use more unconventional techniques of hit and run, of guerrilla warfare, etc. That to go toe-to-toe with us, with the United States, was not going to be successful. Our air power was supreme. Ultimately, even though Hal Moore's forces were badly outnumbered, they prevailed because of the air support. They would drop napalm and of course, bombs. And you could count to it, or you could hear the North Vietnamese soldiers just screaming in terror and in pain from the drops of napalm. What they learned from this, what the North Vietnamese learned from this, is that when you get into battle with the United States, you have to grab them by the belt buckle. Okay, that was the expression. And grab them by the belt buckle means you have to pull them in close, because if you don't, they use the air power. But if you're tight with them, then they face the decision whether or not, while they're being overrun, if they're being overrun, to call an air power over themselves in the hopes that it would be successful. I've talked to a number of Vietnam vets who had to make that decision or were part of being overrun, and they had to call in the American firepower from the air. And this was a real crapshoot as to whether or not you were going to make it out alive. By 1965, in 1965, there were 1,863 Americans killed in Vietnam. But the numbers are going to go up, and I'm going to give you some more numbers in a moment. January 12th of 1966, President Johnson delivers in front of Congress the so-called speech of commitment, in which he says, we're not going to back down. He sees the escalation. The escalation is very apparent now, and says to the country, we're not going to back down. The speech of commitment. And we now begin to fly into Cambodia. And this was against Cambodian airspace, but we began to hit the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Again, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a network of trails, dirt network. It was, in some places, was more out in the open from the air. They brought peasants in to build bamboo tunnels miles long that would conceal people coming down through the trail. And much of it was in heavily forested areas, but it just snaked into South Vietnam. And as I have said numerous times, it was an artery. It was their aorta. Some numbers. 1963, American troop level, 16,300. Killed in action, 118. 1964, by the way, these are all December 31st numbers, end of the year. 23,300, 1964. Killed in action, 206. Now look at 1965. 184,300 Americans in Vietnam combat. This was an increase of about 750%. And the killed in action, as I've given you that number already, 1,863. 1966, 385,300 troops in Vietnam. Killed in action, 6,144. That begins the escalation and Lyndon Johnson's time and his efforts with regard to Vietnam. So we're going to stop there today, Mac, and we'll pick it up the next time and take it a little bit more into escalation up to the turning point, Vietnam War, which was the Tet Offensive.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, very much. That was a very interesting assessment and description of 1965 in Vietnam and some of the actions taken by LBJ that had lasting effects, not only during the war, but afterwards. Again, thank you very much for telling us about those things. This is Mac Payne here, closing out episode 1708 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?